I was studying TF2's walls the other day and discovered something weird. And by that, I don't mean how you can shoot through, taunt kill, or even stick to them. You can check out my other videos to learn more about that. Here, I'm just talking about how they look. Take this brick wall found in Granary and Well. At a first glance, it looks like a simple texture on a flat wall because, well, it is, but there's something more to it that isn't easily distinguishable and which we don't see at all in Source 2. It has something called an SS bump map. But before I even say what SS bump stands for, let's see how this brick texture was put together in the first place. On the technical side of things, there's a file called brickwall001.vmt, which is basically a text file that contains all of the instructions for the material. At the top, it says light map generic, which tells the game to calculate the material's lighting per pixel. Models, on the other hand, like this barrel here in Gorge, have vertex lit generic, which calculates the lighting for each vertex instead, and the pixels in between are interpolated. This isn't as accurate as per pixel lighting, which is why models like this barrel look weird in high contrast areas. You can literally see the interpolation happening across the triangles that make up the mesh. Anyway, going back to the brick wall, the next thing we see is a parameter called base texture alongside a directory and file name. The directory is relative to the TF2's materials folder within the TF2 textures directory pack file, which I can access using a program called GCFscape. So doing that, I'm able to locate and open up that file, which looks like this. And as you can see, it's a texture file. In fact, the file name extension VTF literally stands for Valve Texture Format. It might seem silly considering we typically use things like PNGs and JPEGs, and I think Valve realized this because you can now use them in Source 2. But since TF2 still runs on Source 1, we're stuck with VTFs. Moving on to the next line, we have another parameter called bump map, and a couple of lines farther, SS bump, which is where things start to get interesting. If I open the corresponding texture file, it looks like this. What the heck is it? If you're already familiar with how materials work, you might think that this is a bump or normal map. If you're not, don't worry, because this is neither. Instead, it's an SS bump map. What does it stand for, and what does it do? Well, I'll get to that in a moment. First, I'd like everybody to understand what bump and normal maps are, since that should help in understanding what an SS bump is. All three maps control how light is reflected off of the surface they're applied to. Bump maps do this by using light and dark values. The lighter values cause the area they coincide with to reflect more light back to you, whereas the darker values do the opposite. This is done by skewing the normals, which are lines perpendicular to the surface, towards and away from you. You can think of this like a person using one of those tanning reflectors at the beach. When they point the reflector towards themselves to get more sun, they're also angling the normals towards themselves like a lighter value in a bump map. In 3D applications, this simulates curvature across parts of the texture where the bump map transitions from one shade to another. Normal maps serve the same function, but take things one step further by controlling the skew of the normals in all directions, not just towards or away from you. This is done using RGB color values, which, if you didn't know, are red, green, and blue. By mixing these three colors together, the surface normals can be skewed in any direction, allowing for more control over how light reflects off of the surface. Both maps are well known to 3D and material artists, and are used in practically every modern game, but not TF2. Well, it is, and every community mapper I've seen has used them, but many of the game's stock assets, like this brick wall I keep coming back to, use something else called SS bump maps, where the SS stands for self-shadowing, and believe it or not, it was actually created by Valve. In fact, Valve employee Chris Green wrote an entire paper about it back in 2007, where he dives deep into the inner workings of SS bump. I'll only be covering a small bit of it, so feel free to read the rest of the paper on your own if you find this interesting. And you can also follow Chris on Twitter, where he posts stuff like this on a regular basis. So what does this paper say about SS bump? Well, to start, Chris states that bump maps lack self-shadowing of surface details and ambient occlusion, and that by doing this, you can pause and read this if you want, a kind of ambient occlusion can be added to the texture, which is when certain parts receive stronger shadows in areas we'd expect them to be, like the crevices between these balls. A little further in, he adds the following. SS Bump works with dynamic lights, it provides softer shadows and ambient occlusion, the shadowing information is generated from height data, or bump maps, there is no increase in storage space when compared with normal maps, and it preserves the use of the normal map alpha channel for other visual effects. I know it says bump, but trust me on this. Okay, this all sounds nice, but what does it actually look like compared to a regular bump or normal map? Well, there are two sets of images in the paper. This one up at the top, and this other one toward the bottom. In the bottom one, we see that Chris refers to what I've described as a normal map as a bump map, and a bump map as a height map. This is why I swapped the terminology when going through the bullet points. This paper was written back in 2007, and terminology conventions have since changed, hence the confusion. But I didn't want to just take Chris's word for everything, so I created this test map where we can compare things for ourselves. First, let's see how this brick wall texture looks under all of the different texture maps. Here we have the base texture with nothing else, so it looks flat. Notice how painterly it looks. That's because Valve painted each brick separately in Photoshop over a real-life photo. Next is the base texture combined with the black and white bump map. You can start to see some of the curvature forming, which becomes much more apparent when I disable colors. It looks a little weird, which I think is because I had to enable the SS bump parameter to get it to work in the first place, so I don't think it's an accurate representation of how a bump map should really look, but I couldn't figure out a way to get around it. Now we have the base texture with the SS bump map, which forms the version we see throughout TF2. Now we can see the curvature really take form, especially around the crevices of the bricks. Finally, we have the normal map, which looks similar to the SS bump map, but with a lot more curvature. You might even say that it looks more realistic, but more on that in a second. So which one looks the best? You might think that the normal map is the best for realism, and that the SS bump is better for a game like TF2, where the art style is relatively flat and painterly. And while I wouldn't say that that's a bad takeaway, I do think it undermines a special feature within the SS bump that isn't in the normal. It might be hard to notice at first, especially with colors turned on, so if I turn them off and point a flashlight at both of these walls, we can see how the SS bump really shines. The crevices between the bricks are dark, unlike in the normal, which is the occlusion Chris was talking about. So in a way, the SS bump is more realistic than the normal. But if that's the case, why does it appear to produce less curvature, and why was it abandoned in Source 2? Well, to answer the first question, my guess is that the occlusion effect softens areas where sharp bits are poking out, resulting in better anti-aliasing throughout the texture. So then maybe this normal map setup isn't more realistic and is just missing lighting occlusion information present within SS bump that ultimately makes it appear crispier. Regardless, I think I speak for everyone when I say that SS bump works better for TF2, because you'd never want to have such dramatic changes in a texture's curvature when the entire game is meant to look smooth and cartoony. And despite SS bump being potentially more realistic, it just so happens to bolster this effect. So if SS bump is more realistic, why was it removed in Source 2? Well, as you may have heard, Source 2 uses something called physically based rendering that Source 1 does not. It's the standard across all modern game engines nowadays, and comes with new texture maps that aren't present in Source 1, which includes something called an ambient occlusion map. This nullifies the need for SS bump since you can just make your own texture map to add occlusion instead of trying to lump it together with the normal map. Before I wrap up, you might be wondering about those other things I brought up in the bullet points, like the dynamic lights, storage size, and other visual effects. Well, I can confirm that SS bump does indeed work with dynamic lights, even though we never see them used in TF2, and I can confirm that the file size isn't any higher than a normal map because the size of the SS bump and normal map PNG files are practically the same. In fact, in this case, the SS bump is actually smaller. And finally, by visual effects, I can point to this bullet point at the end of the paper where Chris writes, texture blending for operations such as detail texturing, texture crossfading, etc. are much more straightforward. To give an example, I can point to these two raw ground textures I brought up in my video, Everything Wrong with Dust Bowl, where I described how there's a seam between them even though they use the same base texture and have matching texture scale, shift, and UV coordinates. The texture on the left called Rock Ground 002 doesn't use a bump map. but the one on the right called Blend Rock Ground 004 does, and it uses them in conjunction with this blend modulate texture parameter, which I think is what Chris was referring to when he said texture blending like crossfading. I might be wrong though, so feel free to correct me about anything I may have misinterpreted in the comments. So that's why TF2 isn't normal, both figuratively and literally. It uses an interesting development by Valve that wasn't very well known about to begin with, and which is now obsolete. Thank you for watching. This is LED switching off.